Hello and good evening, everybody. It's the second podcast for this evening. Today I'm joined by a very interesting guest. It's Benny Peiser, and he's involved with the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I believe they're now called Net Zero Watch, which is a play on this whole green story. And the topic today is going to be, I put it broadly as green dogma. It's going to be a conversation as myself and between myself and Mr. Peiser. So
It's Benny.
yeah,
Benny is fine.
Benny. All right, Benny. Well, welcome to this channel.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to understand maybe the green, I would call it theory, political thought, if you will, dogmas, as what I call it. And maybe can you start sort of on yourself? How did you get interested in this topic?
Oh wow, that's a long story. But before I start, can I just clarify? I'm the director of the Global
Director,
Warming
yeah.
Policy Foundation, and we are really a kind of educational charity. Net Zero Watch is a different organization that isn't a charity, that is more focused on the politics. So I'm speaking here on behalf of the Global Warming Policy Foundation,
Okay.
just to clarify this. Well, my involvement in the green discussion and environmental debates goes back to the mid 70s. So basically, for the last 50 years or so, I grew up in Germany, where much of the environmental movement started in the 70s. Really, it started basically with the oil embargo and the oil shock in the early 70s, which led to the plan to build nuclear power plants in Germany, which then resulted in a strong anti-nuclear movement. And as a student, I was myself heavily involved in the environmental movement and was one of the co-founders of the Green Party in Germany. So I know the environmental movement inside out from my own experience in the 70s and 80s. And of course, in many respects, the environmental movement was a response and has been a response to entirely new challenges for human society, societies where humans are around for hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years. But nuclear power is something entirely new. And whenever something new emerges, people are very worried and concerned until we get used to these new technologies. We're beginning to get used to nuclear energy now. There are more than 400 power plants. So, and we have a track record of nuclear accidents, and we know just how limited the effects are. But we are experiencing new things, and whenever new things happen, we as human beings, it's almost natural, we are afraid of these things. So whether it's nuclear energy, or whether it's acid rain, or whether it's climate change, whenever we experience something fairly new, we are worried. Once we get used to these new developments, the concerns decrease, and I expect that to happen with artificial intelligence and other technologies which people are concerned about. It's just human nature.
All right, so it's interesting you mentioned this. So I want to sort of grab onto something you said, which is, as you probably know, France, also following the 73 oil shock, built the what was now called the Mesmer Plan to industrialize, and from what you just said, Germany had a similar plan. And Germany itself, and I'm also a German speaker, although very not as good as some would think, despite my name. It's very interesting to me that Germany would be the country that has gone so far down this route. Neighboring France, yes, we have a ecologue, but it's jokingly called a climat rouge or climat vert, sorry, the sort of a pun on the thing. And while the movement is here, I never get the impression from France that it's as serious to the political economies. It's had that serious impact as in Germany. Now, do you have any reason why Germany in particular was so hardly hit?
That's a good question. I think historically there is a very strong anti-technology streak in German tradition, much stronger than any other country. So a lot of movements long before the Greens. I mean, I'm talking about the 19th century and the 20th century. And let's not forget, the Nazis were the first green movement, political movement in any case. But there's a very deep anti-technology streak, fear, angst in German tradition. Whereas in most West European countries, you have a kind of very almost dogmatic, oh, technology solves every problem. And in any case, in France, the project to build all these nuclear power plants was mainly driven by the left, which used to be very pro-technology and used to be very pro-nuclear until the emergence of a strong environmental movement. So I think you have to understand the origins of German technophobia, and it goes far beyond nuclear. It's basically the whole industrialization of Germany is being regarded as a big sin. Environmental movements, radical environmental movements, started in Germany already in the early 20th century. A kind of mystical view of nature, nature worship, paganism. All of this originated in Germany already 100 years ago, culminated in National Socialism, which was also a combination of nature worship and mystical views of the soil and farming and so on. So there is a historical baggage. I don't want to go into too deep into this, but you asked, why in Germany and not in France, and that is part. I mean, Germany also is a much younger nation than France or Britain, who have very long traditions. Germany is a fairly young and troubled country with a very troubled philosophical baggage, and that angst, that fear of technology or innovation, comes with a with a lot of German tradition.
Mm. Well, it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned there the left in France is what actually pushed nuclear. I mean, the Gaullism. I think in France was actually both sided in many ways because the French,
true.
The right saw it as sovereignty, and the left saw it as jobs for the unions. But I take for example, just to reflect on my own country, South Africa. At the moment, nuclear is being pushed by two strange, what is left, traditional left wing. So the black unions in South Africa, who overwhelmingly brought down the apartheid regime, are entirely in favor of nuclear power. You don't even have to argue with them. They see the benefit of this as a potential to industrialize South Africa and solve the poverty. And also what is latent strains, I suppose, of Afrikaner nationalism, which is not dead entirely, but it's there in the country. But also, there was a certain sense during the apartheid years that we could master something that the British and the Americans did. There was a certain pride in being able to achieve nuclear and being the first African country to achieve nuclear power. And yet, you find in South Africa the forces pushing against this are the forces that I would say are latent from the relationship with Britain, particularly Cape Town, who ironically has the nuclear power station, who ironically gets the electricity from it. The University of Cape Town is involved with anti-nuclear lobbying, openly stating so. I mean, it's not in a secret, and actively going against that, and that comes from Britain, which is a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know. I just want to hear your reflection on that.
Well, the anti-nuclear movement is contradictory. From the left and the Greens is very contradictory, in that, of course, if you're really concerned about climate change, then nuclear is the solution. But the Greens think that nuclear is a problem, more so than climate change. The Germans have shown that they are more concerned about nuclear than climate change because they have closed down all their nuclear power plants. And the Greens, the radical Greens, I mean, there is a division within the environmental movement. There are some sensible campaigners who realize that nuclear is part of the solution in terms of decarbonization. But most Greens actually think nuclear is bad because it generates too much electricity. A lot of Greens are actually concerned about too much energy. They want the degrowth movement. They think that we need to consume less. We need to consume less energy. And the best way of doing that is to have basically run the whole country on solar and wind, which they realize will never generate as much as nuclear, but then they don't want as much energy generation because they fear that the more energy we generate, the more consumption will follow. And they are not just concerned about global warming, they are also concerned about global development. They say, if Africa develops like Europe, we need another planet. That, this is the argument that the developing world should not develop like the US or Europe, because that would basically be unsustainable. So there is much more than just the fear of global warming or nuclear energy. There is a political agenda that actually believes that we have to degrow the economy, shrink the economy, shrink our footprint, shrink our consumption, and live much less developed than the developed world currently lives.
But you see, the way the geopolitics are coming in, just my sense of it is, you can see the statements being made by African leaders. Senegal's leader, a few years ago, the president said that we're just not going to pay Europe's carbon levy. We're going to trade with the Chinese if that's the way you want us to treat us. African Development Bank in 2015 and 14's leader said, yes, we have wind and solar, but let's be clear, we're going to use conventional sources. Okay, Africa's electricity consumption patterns is 1/72th, I think, say 1/70th of Europe, Europe and North America. South Africa is 40% of the continent's electricity, and we have a shortage of electricity. That's government failure. It's not necessarily environmental failure. It's often interpreted that way. But the statements from our ministers in South Africa have become very strong in recent times. Minister Gwedi Mantashe, the Minister of Energy, he's been saying that the just energy transition is a foreign concept. We don't want it. They tried to undermine him, I suspect, through geopolitical pressure by creating what is now called the Minister of Electricity. And surprise, the same Minister of Electricity they created yesterday said, if I had my choice, I would put up back the coal power stations because people are in poverty around that area. Those communities have collapsed. But we are being prevented by policy.
I mean, the geopolitical consequences of Europe's net zero agenda is suicidal. I mean, the developing world cannot afford to move towards renewables, and in any case, the outside world looks at Europe and cannot understand what Europe is doing to itself. They realize that energy prices are going through the roof. I mean, speak about energy poverty in Africa. I mean, we have now almost 100 million people in Europe suffering energy poverty because the prices have doubled essentially in the last 2 years, and they're likely to stay high. But as I said, the wickedness of developed countries like the Europeans and the Americans to essentially demand from the developing countries that they cannot use the energy sources, their own domestic sources, through which Europe became wealthy and the US, became wealthy. And the kind of absolute cynicism of now asking African countries to supply Europe with gas and oil at the same time as they're telling them not to use these resources is just, I'm lost for words.
Well,
But of course, people in Africa and other developing countries realize, India, they realize they will be punished. Europe has introduced a carbon border tax with which they will punish developing exporters who are trying to export their products to Europe on green ground. So, this is all falling apart as we speak. Most European countries already are beginning to water down their own net zero targets. And in any case, as I said, it doesn't make any difference whatever the Europeans are doing in terms of reducing CO2 emissions, if they, continue reducing CO2 emissions, is more than compensated by the growth, the economic growth of countries in the developing world. And of course, they cannot afford to stop that development, and therefore CO2 emissions continue to rise.
Yeah, and what is your view then on these wind and solar? So I'm to give my background. I'm an engineer. I've worked on a variety of infrastructure projects, including offshore wind. And I'd be first to say there's maybe a business case for them in some areas of the world. Denmark seems to have maybe, it can work there. But it's very difficult, even for me as somebody qualified in the field, to come to the truth. How much do they cost? Are they expensive? You read one article, it says yes. You read the other one, it says no. And I don't know. I mean, I look at Siemens' share price. It seems to go down. Then people explain to me and say, but the Germans are taxing here and doing that, and maybe that explains it. And there's always an excuse for these things. I mean, how do you interpret these solutions that are being proposed as sustainable?
Well, we have published quite a lot on this issue of the reliability and the cost of renewable energy, because we are totally agnostic about energy technologies. We don't have any favorite. Most parties or movements or think tanks have their favorite. We are in favor of nuclear, or we are in favor of fossil fuels, or we are in favor of renewables. We don't have any favorite. We don't have any horse in the race. We are completely agnostic and essentially think that the best way is to have policies that reduce the cost of energy, because that's the best for people and for economies and for the stability of societies, is to have affordable energy. Now, renewable energy has a number of problems. The first is that without subsidies, hardly anyone is going to build or develop or deploy renewable energy. In other words, no one is going to build a wind farm without subsidies, and hardly anyone, other than very wealthy people who are virtue signaling, would put up solar panels. In fact, there are more solar panels in Holland than in the entire Middle East. And the reason is, you would expect, solar panels to be very suitable for very sunny countries like in the Middle East. But you have to basically buy them first, and it takes a long time for that money that you spend to recuperate. So therefore, there are not many wealthy. Obviously, you have wealthy sheikhs, but by and large, the Middle East is full of poor people who can't. There are 100 million or so Egyptians. Very few people. There are, of course, solar panels in Egypt, but they are mainly subsidized. And of course, all the solar panels in Holland, where there's hardly any sun, or in Britain, they're all subsidized. No one would put up these renewable technologies without subsidies. That's the problem. The other problem is that if you prioritize renewables, which in most European countries governments do, the knock-on effects for other forms of energy are significant. So, for instance, if you think about a grid which has a large renewable energy sector, like 30, 40, 50%, on windy, sunny days, what do you do with all the other power plants? They have to be shut down, or they have to be compensated, which is extremely expensive. And if you think about, for instance, gas-fired power plants, if you have to ratchet them up and down, their CO2 emissions are much higher than power plants that run 24/7 and efficiently. So you have a lot of unintended consequences, which in the end leads to a significant rise in energy costs, which is why Europe has the highest energy costs in the world, and which is why energy prices continue to rise. So, and how do we know that these are so expensive? Because if you actually, instead of listening to the PR of the green industry, if you look at the actual companies who develop the renewables and look at their costs, and that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at their annual accounts and look at the actual costs as documented in their accounts. You see that the costs are hardly coming down, if at all, and they are beginning to rise again. So we have a serious problem. If renewables were the solution, we wouldn't have the problems in Europe and in the US we have. Everyone would deploy them, everyone would use them, but because they are expensive and they have the problem of intermittency, that they are not reliable, and because we don't have any storage, large scale storage, because of all these reasons, renewables are actually a spanner in the works and cause all sorts of serious economic and technological problems. And to cut a long story short, if governments were to abandon subsidies altogether for energy, then the markets would, of course, go and build the most cost-effective forms of energy, which currently would still be gas and coal. That's what I mean. Gas, perhaps even more so in the US because of the shale revolution. Coal, perhaps more so in parts of Europe. So I'm sorry, that's
not a problem.
my dog, but she will calm down in a second. Just if you could just
no, it's not an issue. It's not an issue. I just want to. You say they're on coal. Now, the interesting thing is natural gas is still, as I understand it, somewhat acceptable. We're seeing Europe moving left and right over the issue. Yet coal itself is seen as the ultimate taboo at this stage. It's maybe one level below nuclear even. Nuclear is becoming more acceptable. But to just give you a picture of where we're coming from in South Africa, South Africa has no oil of significance, maybe offshore a little bit. We don't have a North Sea oil. We manufacture our petrol for our cars from coal. South Africa is endowed with coal that few countries have. Per person, it's some of the highest in the world. It's also good quality coal. The Chinese coal that's being burned comes from South Africa or Australia, right? And the Germans are burning at the moment. In addition, our coal is being used for cement, for fly ash. The green cement in the Burj Khalifa comes from South African power stations, right? Lafarge is selling green cement. They don't tell you it's a coal byproduct. So we actually have more uses for coal in addition to the power generation. And because it happens to be there, it's plentiful, we use it for power generation. So it's within the entire political economy. I think per person, our coal consumption is higher than China's, which China is already significant. And, this is also the case for most Africa if they were to develop all the way up to Zambia, if I understand the geology correctly. So, what this comes down to basically is the message of Africa that's being sent to Africa is you're not allowed to develop with your own resources unless you maybe have gas like Mozambique, or you can use the sunshine you've got. What do you make of this whole response that this geopolitical conundrum that the West is putting itself into?
It's unsustainable, and it's not going to work, and it isn't working because, as we know, the Chinese are burning coal as if there's no tomorrow. The same with the Indians. They're not going to stop. They cannot stop. The moment they stop, there will be a kind of revolution. Because if they stop using coal, their economy goes downhill quite fast. So even if they wanted to, they can't, and that's what's happening. I expect that South Africa won't stop using coal either. They can't, because then the ANC can say goodbye forever to running the country. I mean, I don't want to get into party politics, but
No, but it's happening. It's a fact that the ANC has been we've been put in a very difficult geopolitical position because I can guarantee you the ANC is highly democratic. With all issues they have, it's a highly democratic political party, more so than many European countries. It's one of the few places in the world where you have university professors being challenged by taxi drivers in the same political party. And I've sat in those meetings. I'm not a member, but I've been there. Highly democratic. Sometimes I argue too democratic. They need the lack direction sometimes from all the debates. But be that as it may, they're being put in a position now where we are forced to choose, not in their own will, autocratic regimes like Russia and China for geopolitical survival, basically. So we're being put in that very difficult position. And the West's response is we keep on pushing you, we keep on pushing you. And they don't see it. I mean, give you the best example of this absurdity. John Kerry was in Africa a few months ago, last year, and he goes to the DRC and he says to them, guys, we are all in this together. He flies in with his private jet and he talks to a country where, I don't know what it is, they say 40 or 50% of people might have electricity. And he said, we're all in this together. And the African leaders are just saying, well, the Chinese look more attractive than you guys at this stage, but we don't want to be there,
And that's just the irony that the Americans and the Europeans are driving Africa into China's arms. There's no doubt about it. No doubt. Now, the problem, of course, is China is quite happy to lend money and build roads and so on. But then if you can't pay back, then they basically say, well, now you're half a colony of ours. So, of course, in a way, most African countries don't want to be pushed or forced into a situation where they can't use their own resources. They can't really, and without using their own resource, difficult to develop. I mean, we've published a number of papers on the wickedness of these green policies on Africa, and I mean, even from an environmental point of view, if you prevent African countries to use their own resources and to have a proper national grid and electricity for people. What do? They will cut down the trees, of course. They will use the wood to burn or to heat and so on. So there are, serious environmental impacts. After all, this is what happened in Europe before Europe started burning coal. They burned either trees or killed whales or what have you. So this is unsustainable and it's falling apart. And obviously everyone can see how it's falling apart in Europe. Europe is becoming poorer year by year. Energy costs are going up. Industries are moving out of Europe because it's too expensive, particularly heavy industry, energy-intensive industries. Germany is committing political and industrial self-harm. The deindustrialization of Germany is accelerating, not least because of its very, very expensive energy costs. So people who are observing that will say, do we actually want to copy that self-destructive policy? Of course not. So that's why I'm saying. And there are, of course, the BRICS nations, and South Africa is part of the BRICS alliance, and other countries, I'm sure, will join the BRICS alliance. And they will say, hold on, we're not. I mean, this is all a game. At the COPs, it's an annual ritual. The West will say, okay, so you have to save the planet, and we're all in together in that, and you have to cut emissions, or at least promise to cut emissions. And the developing countries are saying, okay, we're happy to do so, but it costs $1 trillion a year. So if you pay us $1 trillion a year, we'll cut emissions. And of course, the Americans are saying, we're not going to pay that, and the Europeans haven't got any money left, essentially. So you can forget it. It's a geopolitical, unsolvable divide between the wealthy countries which are using the green agenda to protect themselves from international competition, and the developing world that can't afford to go down that route.
Yeah, and the scary statistic for me is by the end of this century, it's now according to UN projections. So those projections, you can never trust them fully. If there's 10 people on Earth, 4 will be Asian, 4 will be African, 1 will be European, and 1 will be North and South American combined. So you're speaking about 8 out of 10 people in the world, and half of America isn't even going along with it. Look at 8.5 out of 10. It's just not on board with this agenda. It's just not concerned about it. So it's so strange. And yet, get your opinion on this, there seems to be no self-reflection from the European elites on perhaps we're wrong. Perhaps we're not going to get there.
I think the European elites, and very similar, America is more divided. You do still have a kind of deep political divide in the US, but not so much in Europe. But they are in complete denial about their own geopolitical status, their declining industries, their rising energy costs. They're in denial. And also, I think they're in denial of the reality of the developing world thankfully developing, and not jumping on this green bandwagon. That's why I'm saying it's not sustainable. What is really missing from the developing world is so far a real counter narrative on these issues. Basically, they are being cornered by Western institutions, European, American institutions, and academics and scientists into a corner where they are essentially saying, okay, you're right, but we can't afford it. And unless you pay us, we can't do it. Instead of actually challenging the whole underlying premise that development is bad, that population growth is bad, that technologies are bad, that resources are bad. Instead of really challenging that and saying, no, we will also develop just like you developed, and the actual risk is much, much smaller than you claim. This kind of, we have 10 years to save the planet. It's a climate crisis. These are scare tactics that are so overact and so exaggerated that someone needs to challenge the hysteria and say, hold on, what is the actual risk in the next 20, 30 years of global warming? What are the implications? And can we live with those risks? Can we adapt to rising temperatures? Because here in Europe is like, they've now come up with a new terminology. It's no longer global warming, it's global boiling. That's the new UN terminology, global boiling. I mean, it's
spinning into the absurd. This is what I find so strange, is the longer the story walks on, the more transparent the absurdity becomes. You see, it went from global warming to climate change. Now it's a climate emergency, global boiling. I mean, I look at the temperatures. So if you sit in Pretoria, South Africa in winter, it's easily -4 degrees, easily. In the afternoon, it's 18, maybe 20 degrees. It can even be 25, 30 degrees, even on a winter day, if the sun is really boiling. Now look at the IPCC projections. It says half a degree, maybe a degree over a century, something like that, as far as I understand it. With that margin and range, it does not seem to me it's going to do much to the human experience anyways. And if there's a risk of a heat wave for a week extra, is that the end of the world?
Well, exactly. And if you actually look at the last 30 years, let's say the last 30 years, and you look what the IPCC predicted 30 years ago, they said, in all likelihood, if we continue with CO2 emissions, business as usual, then temperatures will rise by 0.3 degrees per decade. So basically, at the end of the 21st century, global temperatures will be 3 degrees warmer than they are now. That's what they predicted. In actual fact, the warming that we've experienced over the last 30 years is about half of that. So, in other words, yeah, global warming is happening, but it's much, much slower and much more moderate than was predicted, despite the occasional heat waves, which are anyway supercharged, as we know, through these natural ocean cycles like El Nino, which this is one of the reasons why we have very, very warm summer here in Europe, is because it's an El Nino year. So we have an El Nino. Whenever there is an El Nino, summers are, of course, warmer than if there's no El Nino, or where they have a La Nina, which is a cooling ocean cycle. But the point is that if you look at it, empirically, just look at the warming trend, it's much, much slower than was predicted, and most models still predict. And a slow warming is something, most countries can easily adapt to and do adapt to.
Yeah.
But
you see, this is where I feel my profession, civil engineers, have really failed in the leadership. And I am a member of the Institute of Civil Engineers in the UK. They are all on board with climate mitigation policies. They even ask their candidates, if they want to become an engineer, what do you think about this story these days? Whereas historically, in civil engineers, we build the infrastructures. What we do, infrastructure building is the adaptation. That's all it is. The 7 states in the American West would not survive. 7 would not survive without the Hoover Dam. because there's water necessary. South Africa's water system is highly complex and intermanaged with Lesotho. It's civil engineering in production to adapt to the environment. And this is what we've done historically. This is nothing. We've looked at temperatures. We look at the 100-year patterns of 50-year floods, and we adapted to that. And there's just a complete failure. There's actually going along with the narrative because they get more money from it.
And if you look at I mean, this has been mentioned quite frequently. If you look at the number of people dying from weather-related disasters, heat waves, storms, flooding, droughts, whatever, it has dropped by more than 95, 96% in 100 years. And the reason is not that we have less droughts or less storms or less flooding or less heat waves. The reason is that most countries have developed and we are better protected. And in particular in the developing world, people have either heating or air conditioning, and the housing is better and strong and so on. And of course, the same is true in the developing world. As the developing world develops, they will become more resilient to, heat waves, droughts, flooding, what have you, because the houses will be stronger, the infrastructure will be better, the adaptation will be more sophisticated. And the argument has always been that the best way of dealing with climate change, the most effective, and not only the most cost-effective, but the actual effective way of dealing with climate change is to deal with the impact of climate change. Instead of throwing trillions, onto these wind turbines and solar panels, what are the problems? The problems are people need electricity, people need protection from heat, people need protection from droughts, they need enough food when there's a drought. And we've almost solved the problem of hunger. There's enough food in the world now to feed the whole population.
And energy, actually, if we just allow for and energy.
Energy is there is enough energy. I mean, in terms of gas, the estimates are there is enough gas for the next 200 years if we wanted to use it, if we wanted to. And if we wanted to, we could, move much faster to nuclear if all the kind of stupid over regulations and over risk assessments could be reformed towards reality. So these are problems we can easily live with, and there is still today no indication that global warming, which might continue in the next decades, is accelerating. There is no indication that this is suddenly something that is accelerating. It's a very gradual, very slow, very gradual process to which the world can and should adapt.
Isn't part of the problem here with it that the institutions incentivize this type of ideology, if you will, or ideas to continue? I mean, what do you make? I'll ask you this question very directly. What do you make of the role of the IPCC in this? Is there even a need for such a centralized institution?
Look, that, of course, these international organizations exist. They are highly bureaucratic. They have their own agenda. They have their own environment. They have become much less credible, let's put it this way. But even the IPCC, if you actually, you have to differentiate between the political announcements and the actual scientific assessments. That's the problem, with an organization like the IPCC.
It's a game of telephone, yeah.
The actual reports, if you read the reports, the small print and so on, it's actually not that bad. But when then you have the kind of summary for policymakers, when they summarize it for the politicians, they then highlight and overact some of it, and the kind of statements some of the officials then make is completely exaggerated. So you have that problem. But you have that problem with almost every institutional organization in the Western world, which have been dominated by a very politicized civil service now in almost all countries. All of this will have to be reformed one way or another to provide, to bring back some semblance of balance and of checks and balances, where the political agenda doesn't dominate every assessment. It's a tricky one, because all institutions in European countries definitely are now dominated by a political culture that seems to thrive on scaring the public into certain behavioral changes.
Yeah.
We've seen this with COVID. We've obviously seen this with the climate agenda. The more you scare, or the hope is that you scare people into changing their behavior.
Isn't that maybe part of the issue? I mean, I spoke to Frank Ferrudi some time ago, I can't remember, months ago, and he made the argument that Victorian culture, if you will, or the Stoic culture, had an attitude towards fear, which I think many of the Africans still have, which is that's life. If somebody dies with tragedy, that's it. And consequently, the populations, I think, are a little bit less scared. It also helps that the African population is younger. Our median age is 24. In Europe, it's older.
Well,
isn't that maybe plays part of it?
That explains part of the difference between the Victorian age and today's Europe. Today's Europe, families tend to have one, max 2 children. So the fear of losing a child is much higher. Then in the Victorian age, you had 6, 7, 8 children, and you used to lose half of them. So you are much more used to loss and risk. So it's difficult to compare these two periods, because people had a completely different view of life and life expectancy and of safety and security. People also had a different view of our place in the world. You have to remember Darwinism, evolution, looked at the world as something that happens very gradual, very slowly over, thousands, if not millions of years. Whereas today, everyone is concerned about catastrophes that can happen tomorrow, and an asteroid can hit you on the head. And the irony is, of course, most people have a completely skewed view of risks, so they don't realize that driving a car is much riskier than flying in an airplane or living near a nuclear power plant. But we live in the world we live in, and it will take quite a while to convince people that we actually live in a more stable world today than at any point, perhaps apart from the kind of geopolitical conflicts that we still have. But in terms of economic development, standard of living, food security, and the lack of warfare, despite the war we have here in between Russia and Ukraine, warfare is at one of the lowest points in the history of mankind. And life expectancy is much higher than at any point in human history. So if you look at it from that perspective, we live in a much safer world than at any other time in history. But people don't see that this way.
Yeah, that's very interesting, the contradiction of our time, I suppose. Give you a final question here. Are you hopeful, though, that maybe a younger generation, or maybe even the older generation, is pushing back against this narrative, and this thing will just become a fad of a generation in one sense?
It's an interesting question. I mean, the so-called younger generation always tends to rebel against the older generation. And of course, what they are seeing is that there might be some pushback against the kind of woke culture that benefits the older generation in any case, more over the younger generation. But my view is that the most important thing for society is the ability to access a variety of viewpoints, a whole spectrum of different views. That is the only guarantee for people to look around and make up their own mind. That is basically the only security democracies have, if they allow a full spectrum of views to be aired. And the risk is that some of the woke countries will try, either through censorship or cancel culture and so on, try to stifle that openness. And that's a risk, because that will prevent anyone from challenging conventional wisdom. So we'll have to hope that countries will realize how important it is to keep open the full democratic spectrum of discussion and debate, because without it, it will be difficult to spot the flaws that can bring down countries.
Well, I think on that note, I think we're going to end it there. I'd like to thank you very much for this conversation, and
Thanks for
giving
having
your
me.
time. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you everyone for listening.